The executioner was whistling and swinging his axe idly, because at the moment he had nothing to do. In spite of his business, he really seemed to be a very pleasant man. "The king says you must chop off my head," said Bartholomew. "Oh, I'd hate to," said the executioner, looking at him with a friendly smile. "You seem like such a nice boy." "Well, the king says you have to," said Bartholomew. "So please get it over with." "All right," sighed the executioner. "But first you've got to take off your hat." "Why?" asked Bartholomew. "I don't know," said the executioner, "but it's one of the rules. I can't execute anyone with his hat on." "All right," said Bartholomew. "You take it off for me." The executioner leaned across the chopping block and flipped off Bartholomew's hat. "What's this?" he gasped, blinking through the holes in his mask, as another hat sat on Bartholomew's head. He flipped this one off, then another and another. "Fiddlesticks!" grunted the executioner, throwing his axe on the floor. "I can't execute you at all." And he shook hands with Bartholomew and sent him back upstairs to the king. The king had been taking a nap on the throne. "What are you doing back here?" he said to Bartholomew, angry at being awakened. "I'm sorry, your Majesty," explained Bartholomew. My head can't come off with my hat on. It's against the rules." "So it can't," said the king, leaning back warily. "Now, how many hats does that make altogether?" "The executioner knocked off 13, and I left 178 more on the dungeon steps," answered Bartholomew. 346 hats," mumbled Sir Alaric from behind his scroll. "Uncle Derwin," yawned the Grand Duke Wilfrid. "I suppose I'll have to do away with him. Send him up to the highest turret, and I, in person, will push him off." "Wilfrid, I'm surprised at you," said the king. "But I guess it's a good idea." So the king and the Grand Duke led Bartholomew Cubbins toward the highest turret. Up and up and up the turret stairs he climbed behind them. "This is my very last chance," thought Bartholomew. He snatched off his hat. 347. He snatched off another. He pulled and he tore and he flung them behind him. 398. 399. His arms ached from pulling off hats, but still the hats came. Bartholomew climbed on. 448. 449. 450, counted Sir Alaric, puffing up the stairs behind him. Suddenly, Sir Alaric stopped. He looked. He took off his triangular spectacles and wiped them on his sleeve. And then he looked again. The hats began to change. Hat 451 had not one, but 2 feathers. Hat 452 had 3, and 453 also had 3 and a little red jewel. Each new hat was fancier than the hat just before. "Your Majesty, your Majesty!" cried out Sir Alaric. But the king and the Grand Duke were way up where they couldn't hear. They had already reached the top of the highest turret. Bartholomew was following just behind. "Step right out here and get on that wall," snapped the Grand Duke Wilfrid. "I can't wait to push you off." But when Bartholomew stepped up on the wall, they gasped in amazement. He was wearing the most beautiful hat that had ever been seen in the kingdom of Did. It had a ruby larger than any the king himself had ever owned. It had ostrich plumes and cockatoo plumes and mockingbird plumes and paradise plumes. Besides such a hat, even the king's crown seemed like nothing. The Grand Duke Wilfrid took a quick step forward. Bartholomew thought his end had come at last. "Wait!" shouted the king. He could not take his eyes off the magnificent hat. "I won't wait," the Grand Duke talked back to the king. "I'm going to push him off right now. That big new hat makes me madder than ever." And he flung out his arms to push Bartholomew off. But the king was quicker than Wilfrid. He grabbed him by the back of his fine lace collar. "This is to teach you," His Majesty said sternly, "that Grand Dukes never talk back to their king." And he turned the Grand Duke Wilfrid over his knee and spanked him soundly, right on the seat of his royal silk pants. "And now," smiled the king, lifting Bartholomew down from the wall, It would be nice if you'd sell me that wonderful hat." "$4.98, $4.99, broke in the tired voice of Sir Alaric, who had just arrived at the top of the steps. "And that," he pointed to the hat on Bartholomew's head, "makes exactly 500. "500!" exclaimed the king. "Will you sell it for 500 pieces of gold?" "Anything you say, sire," answered Bartholomew. "You see, I've never sold one before." The king's hands trembled with joy as he reached for the hat. Slowly, slowly, Bartholomew felt the weight of the hat lifting from his head. He held his breath. Then suddenly he felt the cool evening breezes blow through his hair. His face broke into a happy smile. The head of Bartholomew Cubbins was bare. "Look, your Majesty, look!" he shouted to the king. "No, you look at me," answered the king, and he put the great hat on right over his crown. Arm in arm the king and Bartholomew went down to the counting room to count out the gold. Then the king sent Bartholomew home to his parents. No basket on his arm, no hat on his head, but with 500 pieces of gold in a bag. And the king commanded the hat he had bought, and all the other hats too, be kept forever in a great crystal case by the side of his throne. But neither Bartholomew Cubbins nor King Derwin himself, nor anyone else in the kingdom of Did, could ever explain how the strange thing had happened. They only could say it just happened to happen, and was not very likely to happen again. The end.